Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. My name is Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. Thank you all for coming in. Tonight, we're going to do a Q&A show. But to start off things, people have said they want to see what the T-shirt says. So here it is. It says, "News, not Unix." This is a really, really old T-shirt. It's probably 30 years old. I got it back in the 90s. But it's still in reasonably good shape, except for the collar. So I'm going to go ahead and wear it tonight. But like I said, tonight's a little bit of a Q&A show. Q&A shows are generally what I do when I don't have enough time to sort of like put together what I want to put together. And so a Q&A show kind of easy to do, but I got a couple of little odds and ends. So as is always the case, I start off thinking that I don't have anything to say, and then I'm still able to put together like 10 or 15 slides of not having anything to say. So I'm going to do that tonight. I'm by myself tonight. Lissa is off doing a paid gig. She's going to be sort of doing that every other every other week for a while. And I talked to Pat. Pat's off on flying his Skybus someplace, so he's not available. And so it's just me tonight. And so let's go ahead and get started. I see a few names that I don't recognize. So welcome aboard, everybody. And I'm going to get to the Q&A session later. So today I'm going to do a little bit more on Daedalus, and then I'm going to do a few other things. So here we go. In fact, you know what? Why don't I take me off and make the pictures bigger? So, no, I'm going to keep me on. I'm playing around with stuff. Nope, I don't like that either. Let's go back to that. All right, we're going to stick with this. Okay, so here's the agenda tonight. So first, we'll start off with the usual admin slide that'll be the next slide. And then I'm going to do a little bit of Daedalus cleanup stuff. I found an illustration that shows various size options. It gives you some idea about what happens if you change the various size options. And then I found another design that I want to comment on a little bit. Then we'll do some Q&A stuff, and then I'll talk about what I intend to do in the next episode. But first I want to ask you a question. So there's this illustration here. This is the Radiant class. It was designed, I believe, by John Eves, or it might have been, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the other guy who did a bunch of stuff. He's one of the model makers, and he did a bunch of designs. I know that John Eves made a model of it, but there's another name that I'm drawing a blank on, and my apologies. And this showed up as a model, I believe, in an episode of Picard. You'll see that the one on top is labeled USS Stargazer, and it was a model of all the different ships named Stargazer, and one of them was this ship, the Radiant class ship. And so the question I have has to do with some stuff that I want to ask you folks to think about whether I should add it to the list of things that I'm potentially interested in doing going forward. One of the things about talking about all this stuff, especially when I'm talking about the Star Trek portions of it, is there's so much stuff out there with regards to Star Trek that even if you limit yourself to quote unquote canon, you still end up with a lot of discontinuities, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been pretty upfront about the fact that I start with Sternbach and Okuda and what we see on the screen, and I filter it through Pat Doyle and Andy Presby and sort of shake it up a little bit and come up with a story that makes sense to me. And so there's certainly elements of Chris in there that probably aren't elements of Sternbach in there. But as a general rule, I'm not making anything up. I'm not rewriting anything. I'm treating canon as sort of a guidepost and trying to sort of limit myself. I just realized there's this great illustration of canon that I should have put up for this discussion, because it shows different kinds of canon and where they overlap. And there's some people that are like, if it's not on screen, it doesn't count. And then there's other people that like canon is just sort of a starting point for making it all make sense in your head. And I'm kind of in between there, closer to the latter with most stuff. But for the purposes of the show, I try not to get too much into just sort of saying like, well, this is the way I would have done it. One of the things with YouTube shows that are sort of in the same category of this, talking about various science fiction things, is that a lot of them end up at some point going off and creating their own canon. Like 40K Theories had an entire series. Now, they did it 8 years ago in the early days of that channel, but 40K Theory did an entire thing where they did like their own alternative background timeline thing. They just sort of made something up and ran with it for, I've actually got it up here, at least 9 episodes are showing. Oh no, at least 12, 15, 18 episodes. They're all fairly short. They're like, 4 or 5 minute episodes, at least up to episode 25, et cetera, et cetera. And they did a few things like that. Baltimore, another 40K channel, he always does, he writes fiction, and he usually uses the fiction as an introduction to it. And, occasionally a lot of it's his historical interpretation about what's going on. He doesn't just sort of rewrite stuff, but a lot of it is his historical interpretation. And there's a lot of Baltimore's in there that isn't necessarily something that Games Workshop would sign up for. And, the Space Dock people went so far that the original Space Dock crew went off and is doing an audio drama now, and they brought somebody else in to sort of take over doing Space Dock. And they made a great choice. Hujiwana is just absolutely fantastic. If you're not listening to Space Dock or not watching Space Dock, you should be, because he's just absolutely fantastic. But it's really kind of interesting. You go back and you watch the old ones, and it's an entirely different crew, because they created a side project that became their main project. So the question I have for you is, do you think there'd be some value in me doing something like that? And the reason why I put this particular ship up here as an illustration is, I don't know, and I've speculated in the past why the Stargazer had 4 nacelles, right? Basically boils down to, we know that a deflector is a warp, it has a warp generator associated with it. It is the same technology as the engines, and that ship appears to have been, my sort of story I can tell myself is Starfleet decided to do a ship where they were going to use extra engines for long duration, et cetera. And because they had the extra engine power available, they said, we don't need a separate deflector. That's just sort of, that's a 2.5 engine ship. We're going to have a 4 engine ship. We don't need a deflector. We can use the warp field. We can muck with the warp field to do the deflection stuff. But apparently it was good enough that they kept the ship in service. Not so good that they decided to repeat the experiment for whatever reason. It could be the technology changed, and it turns out we improved the deflectors, and now deflectors are the right answer, or that chief of Starfleet operations went off, the head guy left, and the new guy is more of a traditionalist, and he went back to the old way, or whatever. Don't know. But the alternative explanation is, I can come up with a very specific explanation as to why a ship like that would have 4 engines, and why a ship might have 3 engines, and why a ship might have 2 engines. And it basically involves rewriting how ships maneuver in order to do that. And it has to do with maneuverability, and why warships would have 3 or 4 engines, and other ships would have fewer engines, et cetera, et cetera. But at that point, I'm making up canon. I'm doing Chris canon. I'm not doing Star Trek canon. I'm not even pretending to do Star Trek canon at that point. If you guys want to hear me take all the stuff I do on naval warfare and the real world, et cetera, and put it into the blender with Star Trek, and sort of start casting my own stuff in that, I've got a couple of pages, actually more than a couple of pages of notes about stuff, and I'd be willing to share. So let me all know. Wright says Bill Krause, and ding, 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 ding. Bill Krause is the other person involved in this design. Bill Krause and John Eaves are the 2 people interested in this design. So just let me know I've already seen at least one person saying they'd be interested in hearing what I have to say on that. I could just create another channel and go there and do that. But and at some point I am going to create another channel that's going to be more polished. It's not going to be live streams. It's going to be more polished stuff. But I would probably debut that sort of stuff on Starfleet Tactical if I thought there was enough people that were interested. If people are like, no, we like what you do, but don't do that stuff, then I want to hear that too, because I'll just go off and do it for myself and not share. Okay, so that's the question I wanted to do. This is a fantastic design. I absolutely love this design. And there's some very interesting things in there. Like, you can't see it, but there's a small deflector underneath. You'll notice the Sovereign deflector. The Galaxy class had this huge deflector. The small Sovereign had a small deflector. I can speculate as to reasons why. It's also got a smaller profile, so maybe it doesn't need as big a deflector. Maybe the technology's better. Maybe small deflector, but much bigger warp generator behind the deflector. We don't really know. But I got some ideas along those lines. Okay, so moving on. Next thing is some regular announcements. I'm planning on doing a show next week. The only scenario where I see that I don't do a show next week is if I have to go house hunting. I'm trying to buy a house. We'll see if that works. Didn't the last time. But if I end up having to go house hunting, I may not be available to do a show next week, but I'm expecting to do a show next week. I am definitely not doing a show in 21 June because one of two things is going to be the case. I'm either going to go east and be house hunting, or I'm going to go west and be at the Weuve family reunion, go back to the Weuve ancestral homelands and do a family reunion. So regardless, no show next week. And then after that, reply hazy, try again later. It all depends upon when the move happens, how the house hunting goes. There's actually going to be two moves. I've decided this past week that everything in the apartment is one move, and then the stuff in the storage unit is a separate move. And that way I get the apartment all set up, I get the new place all set up, get all the shelves deployed and ready to take the 149 boxes of books and 50 crates of games that will come out of the storage unit. So here's the things that I've got in the queue. I think the next thing that's going to be in the queue is the Starfleet Museum, I think. I'm going to talk about that at the end. But here are some other things that I also want to talk about. That history of ship types is a huge topic. I figure it's 3 episodes on cruisers alone, and then one on frigates and stuff like that, and then one on destroyers, and then one on battleships. But it's at least 3 on cruisers. I've been doing a bunch of research on that. Like, I'm currently reading a dissertation on the difference in cruiser doctrine between the Royal Navy and the US Navy. And of course, every time I think about that, I think about it both in terms of, okay, what are the implications that we see for Starfleet? And also, in part because Starfleet is an organization where a bunch of different smaller organizations came together. That's one of the things that Starfleet Museum stuff, I'll talk about that towards the end of the show, that has in spades. It's just sort of like how the difference between the Royal Navy and the US Navy in terms of how they educated the officer corps and how they thought about doctrine and how they thought about strategy, and as a result, what they were going to do with their battle cruisers. And I could see myself talking about this in another show. The short version of that is the US Navy and the Royal Navy were totally and completely divorced from each other in terms of what their approach is, what they intended to do with the battle cruisers, etc. So there's lots of interesting things that get me every time I read Star Trek. It gets me thinking about the real world, or read science fiction. It gets me thinking about the real world. Every time I read the real world, it gets me thinking about science fiction. And so that's going to happen. I want to do one on shields and armor, different types of shields, different types of armor. We saw a little bit of that when we talked about Iron Empires, and about how the different types of active armor that there is in that show. And we've got plate, what do they call it in Enterprise? It's not shields, it's plating. But they've got the electrified plating thing in Star Trek. They've got shields in Star Trek. You've got force fields in E.E. Doc Smith, and all these things work differently. And so I want to do a thing that talks about the different types of armor, including real world armor, and the different types of shields. In fact, I'll probably invite Chris Carlson on for this because he knows real world armor. And that is one that I want to do before I do the history of ship types, because so much of specifically the history of cruiser design is predicated upon the fact that they had all these different armor schemes. And that's what made cruisers hard and interesting, because you had heavy and light cruisers, you had protected, unprotected, and armored cruisers, and then you had a different type of light cruiser at a minimum. And then you had frigates that really looked more like cruisers, except they called it a frigate because it only had one gun deck, despite the fact that it was the largest ship. And at that point, somebody in the Royal Navy said, our ship classification scheme is totally broken down. Maybe we should use a new one. And they came up with a new scheme. So worth talking about. It's probably not on the list, but probably worth adding to the list is talking about naming and typing stuff, because I've talked about that in the past, but it's been a couple of years since I've talked about that. It's probably worth bringing back out, talking about that again, and because I've been doing some more thinking, doing some more research on that. Standard caveats apply to this episode. I often interpret others' works. They may not agree with my interpretation. All the images, etc., are the property of the originators. I'm trying to add educational value through criticism and commentary. I am not trying to, infringe on anybody's copyright. I try to tell you who did a particular thing. Like, one of the problems with the Daedalus stuff, I did a pretty good job with Daedalus, but like tonight, I've got a couple of new illustrations. They were Pinterest posts. They weren't cited. Somebody else just threw them up on the web. Somebody who clearly just found them and put them up on the web and didn't tell me where they came from. And so I'm not telling you where they came from because I don't know where they came from. But if any of you are the artist, please let me know. I'd love to trumpet you on the air. I always like to do that. And as always, nothing I say should make you not enjoy something you currently enjoy. Okay, next slide. Okay. This is an illustration that I found on Pinterest that talked about the size of the Daedalus class. So you'll see I put the little chart there, was there before. Most of the answers are 104. Most of the different people that talk about a ship that's 104 meters long. The biggest one we see there is 140. And, we see here we have 104, 131, 157, and then that last one is 209. I have no idea where 209 and 157 came from, because this was presented literally with no context. It was just this illustration, no context that I found. But boy, it's interesting seeing how things change. I actually have a tendency to kind of like no bigger than 131. I kind of like the smaller ones. And the reason why I like the smaller ones is because this is a ship from the early days. It's clearly intended to be something that they just sort of like, we need to build ships and we got to build a lot of them. We got to build them fast. So we're just going to make them as simple as we possibly can. And we're going to build a bunch of them. And they're going to be, it's going to be the equivalent of taking a sailing ship to the New World, right? It's nothing fancy. It's small and cramped and just a total workhorse. And in the end, they've retroactively canonized that the Daedalus class is the ship that basically did all of the initial first contacts. In the original series, anytime you hear somebody say like, yeah, there was a ship that came by here and left a book on the Chicago mobs behind, and now everything's screwed up because they think they're all mobsters. It was always one of the Daedalus class ships that did that. And so I kind of like this idea that it looks small and crude and not much fun to be on, but it's still kind of cool. So in any event, I just thought that illustration was kind of interesting. Next is, I'm going to talk a little bit about a new design. So first, I want to highlight a couple of designs that I particularly liked from the last time around. We got the Chris Weuve fan film. This is not the version of the Daedalus that he did for Alec in the 4 Years War Hospital refit video that we watched a couple of episodes ago, 166. This is a different design that he did before that, and it's got a big, thick connecting tube that is aligned with the deflector, and it's got this sort of structure on this back, the humpback on the back of the secondary hull. You can very easily tell yourself a story that the engine room is high in the secondary hull, where it's got a direct feed right into the warp engines, and it's got a plasma conduit running directly to that deflector up front. It does have that as the people tank. It's going through, it's going through the people tank. Also, that connector is clearly the people transfer also. And so, there's part of me as the would-be starship designer says, I don't want the warp plasma anywhere near people if I can possibly avoid it. I can tell myself the story that this is the ship design where they said, on second thought, maybe we should make it segregated a little bit more and not do it this way. And so that's why you end up with a separate saucer section that has the deflector there, so they can keep all that nasty warp plasma and just keep that warp plasma just out of the people tank, right? Keep it out of the people tank. The second one is the E.C. Henry from Pacific 201, and you can see it's got two tubes. He moves the sphere down a little bit. Neither one of those tubes quite lines up with the deflector, but I can squint a little bit and maybe make it work, and maybe shuffle those tubes around and make a few modifications, make that work. And so that's an interesting design. We got the Ethernaut design, which is basically the standard one, but it's a little bit better. It's got a little bit more. It's got a very pronounced hunchback there, and you can tell yourself the story about the warp engine, the warp plasma coming from an engine room that's right there, and the warp reactor being right there. Keep that one in mind. We're going to see something that looks very similar to that in the next slide. And then there's the Mad Koi Fish version, which I clipped off a little bit more I meant to clip it at the bottom, but I ended up clipping at the top. Bad on me. But that's a very similar to that design. The primary difference there is a little bit difference in the shape of the secondary hull, and it's got nacelles that are not angled forward. Struts to the nacelles that are not angled forward. And so I wonder about that angle forward. What does that get you? And I can come up with a couple of stories, like maybe it has something to do with their ability to bend plasma around a curve or around a corner, and for some reason it's more beneficial to do it that way. Or it could be something about, hey, the ship was a little bit long for some of the berthing facilities we had, some of the dry docks we wanted to put it in. We wanted to be able to bring it into a enclosed environment, but it's longer than what the previous Starfleet standard was, and as a result of that, it doesn't fit. So we had to sort of cheat a little bit to move the nacelles forward so it would fit. There's been instances where in the real world there's been ship designs that have had to cheat a little bit to make it fit like that. So that's those. This is the new one that I found, and as you can see, it's pretty darn close to the Ethernaut version, but it adds this element of a second tube. And I like that a lot. And if you look at it, you can see it's got the hunchback, which I sort of hypothesize might be where the engine room is, or the warp reactor, and that it's got a straightforward right into that navigational deflector, so you can power that warp generator that's part of the navigational deflector. It's got a straight pipe directly from the warp reactor. I kind of like that design. So let's play around with that design just a little bit. Okay, so in the top one, that's a straight stick design. All I did was add two rectangles to cover those tubes, a circle around the sphere, and then a green line that runs directly to where the deflector is, giving you, like, if you wanted to have a straight path, that's what that straight path would look like. As you can see in that first one, boy, that works really well, right? That straight path, you can easily imagine that there's a warp reactor that's got a Y bracket, a Y manifold, and it's got one going forward to the deflector dish, and it's got two going off to the sides of the pylons, and hey, that works great. I can point exactly where to design where that manifold is. The second one says, what if we decided that the smaller pipe made more sense for the plasma conduit, right? Because it's just the plasma. And maybe an access way like a Jeffries tube to do it, but you're not moving lots of stuff through there. There's no elevator going through. You don't need, the other one is the one where you're moving people through and you're moving big stuff through, et cetera, et cetera. And the smaller one, what if you decided that the smaller one was the plasma one and you end up dropping the sphere down so that it aligns with the smaller tube? Well, that changes where the plasma conduit would be, but I can still draw a straight line and I can still project down from those pylons. And I think I don't have a front view of it, but I think I can probably make all that work in a manifold, right? I think I can make it all come together in the same way in sort of a, three-pronged Y-shaped manifold there. And so I think I kind of like that. And I kind of like the sphere being a little bit lower too. I think it works better, especially since if the secondary hull, in a lot of the Starfleet designs, the secondary hull has a big deflector dish at the front of it. And so you need to have the people tank, the primary hull, up high enough that you've got line of sight from the deflector. If it doesn't have a deflector, you don't need to do that. You can have it just come straight out. The last one flips the small and the large one. I just flipped the small rectangle and the big rectangle, but imagine that it's flipped and the small one's up top and you still have the hunchback, and it's probably a little bit higher there. It's probably that the bigger one comes in a little bit lower in the sphere, but approximately that's what you end up with. And it also sort of anchors on the idea that the plasma conduit, the small one, is the one that carries the warp plasma to power that. Regardless of which one of those versions you like, I think they all look nice. I think that's a nice design. I kind of really like the ones that have the two connectors. It sort of adds to the industrial look that it has. And you can see how the Starfleet aesthetic is over time. The ships are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're just looking nicer over time. Until, you start off with this thing that's a workhorse that's sort of like the equivalent of an old tugboat. And by the time you get to the Galaxy class, you get, it's like a luxury hotel going to sea, or a luxury hotel going into space. So that's it for that. Okay, so now it's question and answer time. I'm going to go back and look through the questions and answers and see what we've got so far. So if you've got anything that you'd like to ask about Daedalus, about anything else, go ahead and ask. Okay, so let's see. Wright is off driving. Drive safely. So the question is, do those of us at Ares Studios find time to play Star Trek Fleet Command? I have not played it. I don't know if Alec has played it, or any of the other people that are sort of associated with Ares Studios. We're not all co-located. It's not really, it's a YouTube channel, right? And so at one point, Alec was thinking in terms of having a channel for Axanar and a channel for Ares Studios. And so he could then segregate things like Starfleet Tactical and other things that were more speculative from stuff that was just strictly news about Axanar. And so the one was going to be strictly Axanar news type stuff. And the other one was going to be everything else. And at some point he backed off that because he discovered that people just subscribed to the Axanar channel and not nearly as many people were interested in the Ares Studio channel. And it didn't matter what the content was. So, okay. So that's what we did. So I have not played Star Trek Fleet Command. I also haven't played Star Trek Online. Part of it is I'm a Mac user. And a lot of this stuff just isn't available in the Macintosh in the same way that is. Although I think Star Trek Fleet Command is available on iOS. I need another hobby, like I need a hole in the head. That hasn't stopped me from getting new hobbies every now and then. Let's see. Hello to Matthew. Dustin asked about the Gemini class from Star Trek Online. Let me do a quick search on that. Gemini class Star Okay. Looks like it's a battleship. Oh, yeah, 4 engines. That thing. I remember that. And it also has something called the Sagittarius class, which looks like it's way, way farther down timeline. It's described as a Sagittarius class temporal cruiser. So that, yeah, way, way down timeline. Yeah, that's kind of, that works. That works. Let's see. I'm seeing some people say that they'd like me to do some stuff, speculative stuff. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, Dustin says something about class takes the best of the Ares class and makes it into a long range reaction speed ship. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Why would you want to have multiple engines like that? Well, the easiest way to make your engines last a long time is to not run them at full performance. Buy an engine that's bigger than you need and only run it at 80%. Never run it at 100%. And that's what they do with airplanes a lot of times. The P3 has an engine that's a little bit bigger than what it needs, and they would run it at like 80%, and they made it last longer. A lot of ships and airplanes are like that. So having 4 engines means, if you had to, my guess is, because of the way warp limits work, my guess is you probably run into limits that prevent you from going much. It's a steep curve at the end. You can probably get very close to your top speed on less than four engines. That's certainly the case on, for instance, like a destroyer. The most fuel consumptive thing you can do with a naval gas turbine is to turn it on. Just turning it on increases your fuel consumption. And so a lot of times they cruise around on only 2 turbines, and the other 2 are turned off because it uses less fuel. And because of the way that drag works, you've got 4 turbines. You can get to 20, 22 knots on 2 turbines. And you'd bring the turbines 3 and 4 on when there's something special going on. Like for instance, you need to have quick reaction time, or you need to be in a situation, and I mean quick reaction as in you need to maneuver quickly, or like if you need to do high speed. And so what's an example of like when you do quick reaction time? I was aboard USS O'Kane, DDG 77 off the Hawaiian Op area. And I'm on the bridge wing. We're going to do an underway replenishment. And I hear a call over the intercom, the 1MC. The restricted maneuvering doctrine is in effect. And about 30 seconds later, there's a big puff of smoke that comes out of the smokestack. And then there's another puff of smoke. And I turned to the young lieutenant next to me. He's like a JG, I think. I said, "What was that?" And he said, "Oh, they're lighting off the turbines. Because since we're at restricted maneuvering, sir, we bring all the turbines online. So if we need to maneuver quickly, because like, for instance, we're about to have a collision or something, we've got the extra power available, and gas turbines respond really fast." I once heard a ship CO talk about this, the CO of Porter. He talked about how back in the old days, under steam turbines, when you'd go to pull away from the ship that you were doing an underway replenishment with, it took a while for you to sort of speed up and get away. And so the oiler would be playing what's known as the breakaway song. So you get to pick a song that you play, that you play to, actually they play it when you pull up. They're playing a song for you, and then when you pull away, you play a breakaway song for them, if I remember that correctly. And the issue was that he said, you used to be that you could listen to an entire song as you sort of crept away, and now with gas turbines you just push the throttles forward, and by the end of the first verse you're out of earshot and you can't hear what they're. Guess that must be that they're playing to you at that point. It's also interesting listening to them on the very large loudspeakers, the 2 COs having a conversation about what song should they put on the big speakers. Underway replenishments are always fun with the US Navy. There was one ship, I don't remember which one, but it was one of the DDGs. They had two of these sumo wrestling suits. So there's guys with wearing these big sort of padded suits, and they go out on the flight deck, the helicopter flight deck, and they would be wrestling out on the flight deck whenever they did an underway replenishment. That was just their shtick. Navy has a lot of things with shticks like that. I'd like to see more stuff like that in Star Trek, like just on this ship, we all wear, funny hats or something like that every now and then. A lot of times they do stuff like that because otherwise all the days blend together. If you're working, you have to change your routine a little bit. If you're working basically 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, on Sunday they have a different schedule. It's useful to have a different schedule, and they will frequently do things like they'll have a set meal schedule, like Friday is pizza, or no, Saturday was pizza. I forget what was on Friday. But each ship will do it differently, but they'll have a set schedule. And because you want to do stuff that indicates that time is passing. Otherwise, all the days look the same. I asked a colleague of mine when I was at the Center for Naval Analysis, he got flown out to a carrier to be the carrier rep for OIF. Maybe it was OEF. I can't remember if it was Afghanistan or Iraq, but he gets flown out for it. I think it was Afghanistan. And then he comes back afterwards, and I said, "Hey, Mike, how'd it go?" And he goes, "Typical 3-day trip." And I said, 3 days? And he said, "Yeah. There's the day you get there, there's the day you leave, and there's the really, really long day in between, because they all look the same." That's why a lot of ships have a different schedule on Sundays. They'll have brunch on Sundays. And it's specifically so that there's something to sort of break it up. Anyway, okay. Okay, lots of people saying they'd be interested. Okay. Dustin talks about the Intrepid light cruiser frigate. Yep, there's a few that polarize the hull plating. That's what I was trying to think of. Thank you, Matthew. There's been a handful of 4-engine ships that's actually going to come into play when we talk about the Franz Joseph stuff, because it's a little bit, I'll go into this in more detail, but Franz Joseph has like single engine ships, and he's got a dreadnought that's got 3 engines and stuff like that. And early on, Franz Joseph and Gene Roddenberry got along great. And then they didn't. And I think it's because Franz Joseph had the temerity to point out that that other people had ideas. And Gene Roddenberry, as a general rule, didn't like it when somebody implied that not everything that was done in Star Trek didn't spring from his brow, right? He had a tendency to want to take credit for everything, despite the fact that Robert Justman defined a bunch of stuff. There was lots of people that, like the United Federation of Planets was not something that Roddenberry came up with. That name came up with by somebody else. And so Roddenberry then wrote these rules on how the ship design had to be. And he specifically wrote a set of rules that the Franz Joseph design stuff did not pass muster on. And it was specifically to say, yeah, your stuff doesn't count. It's not canon. You didn't follow the rules. So I'll talk about those rules when I do the Franz Joseph design stuff. So we see some 4-engine ships now. We saw them in Discovery, and we see them in some other places. But for a long time there just weren't very many 4-engine ships. And I would imagine 4-engine ship probably uses a lot of antimatter. Ethernaut does have some jaunty angles. I kind of like the jaunty angles there. Yeah, Dustin says that he could see the Pacific 201 as being a newer refit Daedalus class to extend the Daedalus class. So it's worth going. One of the things I like about what E.C. Henry has done is that he's got these little ship histories videos where he throws up the 3D model and looks at it from different angles and talks about what he did and why he did it the way he did it. And you know, the little stuff like his Pacific 201 Daedalus has turrets that pop out, and that kind of give you an idea of how big he thinks it is. There's turrets that pop out, and there's other little things, and he talks about it. And I don't agree with everything that he's done. I don't. He's a very talented guy. And one of the things I do like about it is that he's got a defined design aesthetic. And he does what he does for a reason. He's not capricious in what he's doing. He's thought it through, and he does stuff for a reason. His aesthetic and my aesthetic don't quite match. And so there's places where it's like, yeah, I understand why you think that looks good. I don't think it works as well. For instance, he's got that curve in the nacelles of the Daedalus. It just does this sort of curved 90-degree thing. I'm kind of like, as a general rule, the story I tell myself in my head is that you don't want plasma doing that if you can avoid it. You kind of want plasma going in straight lines. Now, that's just my design aesthetic. That's just sort of how I view it. Andy Presby would point out that the right place to tap power off of a plasma stream is at a right angle, that there's a physics reason why that's the right place to do it. And so right angles are good because it gives you a natural place to put a tap. But I don't like the curve on nacelles. I've never liked curves on nacelles, on nacelle struts. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, there's Dustin also says something about multiple changes and using different repair spare parts. I can easily see a situation where they're pulling stuff from different places, especially during the war. If you believe in the Daedalus backgrounds that talk about this being a ship that they built during the war, then, you know, war expediency stuff. Like, no two PT boats in the Pacific had the exact same weapons fit. They all came out of the factory with the same weapons fit, but everybody decided they wanted more weapons, and so they just scrounged stuff and put it on. And then they had to scrounge to get ammo for it. And you know, if you've read about John F. Kennedy and PT-109, they had some sort of grenade launcher that was totally non-spec that they used. So I can see stuff like that happening. Yeah, Dustin also says he wonders how much time holodeck saved on Starfleet Academy battle simulation stuff. And repairs from the cadets constantly blowing the battle simulator room, you know, because you had all that stuff that happened in beginning of Wrath of Khan. That's a really good escape room. So, you know, they try to make this stuff realistic. And they make it shoot out sparks and stuff like that. But, you know, we've seen other things that have done stuff like that, where it just sort of, you know, there's a little tube and it's shooting stuff out of the little tube. It's not actually sparks coming out of the console. It's coming out of a dispenser. So I'm not sure that that's the case. Holodeck stuff is way down timeline, though. I mean, holodecks, I don't think we know exactly when holodecks, that technology became standard. It's certainly not on Enterprise, the original Enterprise. And I don't recall seeing anything that shows it in like the Excelsior class. So it's probably later than that. The question is it new to the Galaxy class, or does the Ambassador have it? So it's certainly useful, because you can certainly do a bunch of other scenarios in there. There's there's the episode. It was the episode where Picard is captured by the Cardassians, right? So they spend a lot of time in the holodeck running a simulation of infiltrating the planet. So that was actually pretty cool. So, Cosmo Flanker says there's a proto holodeck in the animated series. You know, last time I watched the animated series, I was 10 years old, so I need to go back and rewatch it. Yep, Wright points out that he used to be the shot line gunner on board the ship when he was in the Navy. So what he means by that is when you're doing an underway replenishment, you got to get a hose from one ship to the other ship. So how do you do that? And the answer is a guy with a rifle that has a thing at the end and a line attached to it shoots the line over to the other ship. And they attach it to a bigger line. And then you pull the bigger line back to you. And then I think at that point you attach it to an even bigger line and they pull it back to them. And then eventually you get to the point where you got a big enough line that you can put it in something and you can actually have a hose with hangers running down the line. So the hose, there's a line that sort of provides the tension and the support for the hose that connects the two ships. And they're locked into devices that have reels so they can reel in and out because you're trying to keep the ships a certain distance apart. It's harder than it sounds. We've had a lot of practice. It's both harder and easier than it sounds because of the way that you've got water rushing through the tube that's created by the two ships being close to each other. And that has some interesting hydrodynamic effects. And then you've got guys on both decks holding a line that's got flags on it so that the flags are at a set distance apart so you can tell like how far apart the ships are. You're basically aiming for like 80 feet, if I remember correctly. And they're basically doing not quite tug of war. They're not trying to pull it over. They're trying to keep the flags, the flags on their ends on like right over the edge of their ship. And so that way the captain who's on the bridge wing can look down and see whether the ships are the proper distance apart, and he can maneuver accordingly. The oiler's basically just straight and narrow. The ship that's getting the fuel is the one that's doing the maneuver. Because the oiler might have another ship on the other side of it. It's generally, transferring fuel off of both sides at the same time. So it's really kind of a trick. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Bob points out that the holodeck tech power, when does it become efficient enough that you can put it on the ships? I mean, we go out and we find oil. Sometimes those oil deposits are pressurized. We don't even have to pump it really. It just sort of spouts up in the air, right? But, at some point we generally put a pump on it, right? And we take that oil and we run it through a process that uses energy, but the resulting product is able to generate more energy than it gets out of it, right? So then you put into it. Refining oil is a net positive in terms of you have more energy at the end of the process than you started at the beginning. Not a violation of conservation of energy because we're sucking the stuff out of the ground, right? It's not a closed system. We're pulling in stuff from the outside. We refine it into various fuels that we can then use to generate more power and refine more oil. Antimatter doesn't work like that. Antimatter is created, and antimatter is a way of storing a bunch of energy. And you're putting energy into it, and it gives you this nice dense fuel, but you're putting energy into it. It's free from the standpoint that I believe it says somewhere in Sternbach and Okuda that as a general rule, antimatter is made through giant solar arrays that are powering it. And so from that standpoint, you pay for the arrays, but the sunlight is free, and you're creating something like that. So why am I going down this sidebar on antimatter? I really sort of feel for this, power efficient enough to put on starships, because everything on starships is very energy intensive. Starting with the warp engines, I'm sure the hotel load is a lot, nothing compared to the warp engines. But, anytime you're saying we're going to spend more antimatter to do something, you better have decided that it's worth doing. And it really kind of needs to be as energy efficient as it possibly can be, because antimatter is going to be expensive. So, Stephen Ross says the Canadian Navy had an underway replenishment as part of their recruiting commercial back in the 70s. That's seriously cool. I really, really like that. Because underway replenishment is, in my mind, you're not even really a Navy if you can't do underway replenishment. You don't count. Underway replenishment is sort of like the bargain basement. This is what you need to be able to do to get into the door. If you can't do that, you're at best a Coast Guard. Our Coast Guard is really good. Our Coast Guard does underway replenishments. When they're with the Navy, they do underway replenishments. They are equipped for it. But yeah, if you can't do underway replenishment, if you can't support your forces at sea that way, you're not really Navy. At the very least, you need to be able to get gas from somebody else. So you need to have the expertise and the equipment to be able to hook up to somebody else's tanker. You don't necessarily need to have a tanker of your own, but you need to be able to hook up to somebody else's. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. Go ahead and add some. I'm going to go ahead and do the last slide here. I think it's the last slide. Yeah. So why am I talking about doing the Starfleet Museum? I'm pretty sure I'm going to do this. Why am I talking about it? So first of all, it's a natural follow-on to the Daedalus discussion. I pulled some illustrations in the last show from the Starfleet Museum. And it has a very nice write-up of its ship history. I mean, basically, let me dial back. What is the Starfleet Museum? It's basically a website of extended fan fiction by Masao Okazaki. And he did this stuff originally back in the late 90s, like 2000, 2001 timeframe, 97 to 2001, if I remember correctly. And he did a lot of external ship designs for the fleet, the Starfleet, as of like the time that Starfleet was formed, and the Earth Romulan War and the immediate formation of Starfleet right afterwards. And so because he's doing ship designs, he's got ship histories of that. And so, and, you know, he did nice illustrations of all this stuff. None of it is canon, and all of it was heavily negated by Star Trek Enterprise when Star Trek Enterprise came out. But he's got basically a history of the Earth Romulan War up there. He's got the formation of Starfleet, and in his background, there was the United Earth, basically Navy, and then there was the United Earth Interstellar Probe Agency, I think is what it was called, basically the exploration branch. And when we found ourselves fighting a war with the Romulans, we put all those forces together. So basically, you can sort of think of it as we took the Coast Guard and made them part of the Navy. And there was some, and so there, like part of the write-up for the Daedalus class talks about how all the space probe people were really, really hoping that after the war, they'd split them back out again. Because you got the guys that are, you know, want to blow stuff up, and you got the guys that just want to go explore. And, you know, if you think about it, two very different missions, it's sort of interesting. They're part of the same organization. And so the idea was that they kind of wanted to be separate from that. And that didn't happen, but they both ended up using the Daedalus class. So there's a lot of very interesting fan fiction background stuff in there that's worth exploring. And there's a lot of evolution of ship designs, because during this time period, according to Okazaki, we go from deuterium fusion driven ships to matter antimatter ships. So it's a time of great change in the technology, and that's reflected in the ship designs. Now, there's also extensive design notes from a guy named Alan Rolfs, who saw this stuff and said, "Hey, can I do the insides? Can I like do the blueprints for this stuff?" And Okazaki said, "Sure." And so Alan Rolfs did the insides. and he did all the right, and he has extensive design notes on why he did stuff the way he did. And like I said, very thoughtful designer. And of course, very thoughtful means that he shares my philosophy about a bunch of stuff about ship design, and he has similar criticisms about some of the other designs out there. Like you got to have room for equipment. You got to have room for fuel. You got to have room for the structure of the ship. It's not an office building. It should be designed like a ship. You've got places where there's like big ribs that hold the ship together, big structural components. He also talks about, he tries to line up all the bulkheads between the various levels, because if your bulkheads are lined up like that, like in the real world, you line bulkheads up because it increases the rigidity of the ship by having a bulkhead, the same bulkhead in the same place. And also it means you can do high bays, right? I got a piece of equipment that's 2 decks tall. I just won't build a floor there. I'll put catwalks around the big piece of equipment that's 2 decks tall. That's the way that real ships work. Up on top, you got the people areas. You go down and out far enough, and you start getting to places where there's big pieces of equipment and catwalks around it, because the big piece of equipment takes priority. And you're just trying to fit the people areas around the big pieces of equipment. And so the farther down you go in a ship, the less and less it looks like a building. That's just kind of the way that works. And so if you want to sort of go play around with it, the URL is really simple: www.starfleettacmuseum.org, starfleet-museum.org. Very easy to go find. So I'm going to spend some time in the next show talking about all the stuff I see and pulling things out of the design notes and things that I really sort of like in there. Okay, let's see. Bob added something. Yeah, I like this. Star Trek exploration and combat missions, kind of like the dichotomy of SAC's old motto of peace is our profession, being quoted by missile jocks that really wanted to see our ICBMs fly. I don't know that I ever met a missile jock that actually wanted to push the button, but they were all prepared to push the button. Boy, were they prepared to push the button. Boy, were they prepared to push the button. So I used to work for one. When I started in the Pentagon, I had an internship with Air Force Colonel in the Psychological Operations Directorate. And his very first job in the Air Force is he'd been a Titan missile guy. Titan and Minuteman are different. Not just different missiles, different launch complex philosophies. A Minuteman complex is the capsule is about the size of my living room, dining room here. Tops. A couple of bunks in the corner. You can pull a curtain to sort of, there's a head over in the corner, but there's some chairs on rails in front of capsules, places to put keys and turn keys, stuff like that. They're small. You only spend 24 hours in it. At some point you sack out. You take turns. Somebody's always awake. You do drills when they do drills. You do all that stuff, but it's small. Titan missile complex, on the other hand, the idea is that you go down for 3 or 4 days, and it was basically an apartment. You were there for 3 or 4 days, and you had reliefs and stuff like that, and they were a lot bigger. And so, like when you see people that have converted silos, the government sold these things off, etc. Those are like Titan silos. Those are not Minuteman silos, because Minuteman always had these small capsules. We kept a handful of Titans in the inventory for a long time because they had a really big warhead. If you want to read a really good book, there's a book called Command and Control that the subtitle talks about the Damascus incident. Damascus, Arkansas is where one of these things had an accident. And the accident specifically was somebody dropped a big wrench from up high, and it bounced off the scaffolding on the side and hit the rocket and punched a hole in the side. And the hypergolic propellant started spewing out. And they were pretty sure it was going to blow up. It didn't blow up for like 6 or 8 hours, but it did blow up. And Command and Control tells the story of that and how they thought about making weapons safer and what they did and didn't do to make weapons safer. So it's a very interesting book. Bob says he knew a couple people that actually did want to launch. Lissa, glad that you could drop in. She's doing something else, but she's just dropped in to say hi. And let's see, Wright safely made it to his hotel in Bowling Green. I think he's doing the power tour. I suspect he's doing the power tour. And so I'm glad you made it safely to your hotel. So, okay. So, let's see. I don't see any questions. We are just about a little minute and a half beyond the 1 hour mark. So I think this is a good place to stop. And so once again, as always, I am, okay, hold on a second. Let me make me big. I am always pleased and honored that a group of people are willing to spend their Saturday evening listening to me talk about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. So I very much appreciate that. And I would like to thank you very much for being willing to do that. And I look forward to doing it again next week. So with that in mind, have a good weekend, everybody. Talk to you later.